Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Zubair Kamau stood at the edge of the veranda of his modest home, overlooking the bustling heart of Lagos, a sprawling, vibrant city full of opportunity and despair in equal measure. Cars and tricycles, known locally as Kiki, wove in and out of the chaotic traffic below, their horns blending into a dissonant urban orchestra. The bright Nigerian sun cast shimmering rays across the metal roofs, intensifying the heat that clung to Zubair's skin. Even with the hustle and hum all around, his mind was elsewhere, weighed down by a heavy heart. From the corner of his eye, he saw his wife, Amara, step onto the veranda. She was a striking woman, with warm brown eyes that glowed with kindness and a gentle smile that had once made Zubair feel like the luckiest man in all of West Africa. When he had first met her during their university days in Ibadan, her laughter alone had been enough to draw him in. She possessed a quiet strength and an unrelenting optimism that had carried them both through many challenges. Yet that same optimism was waning now, replaced by the silent frustration of an unfulfilled dream, motherhood. They had tried for years to conceive a child. They visited fertility clinics in Lagos, Ibadan, and even made trips outside the country to Accra and Johannesburg for specialized consultations. But every test and every consultation seemed to lead to the same discouraging conclusion: Zubair was sterile. At first, they held on to hope that science would offer a miracle. But as time wore on and their finances began to dwindle, Zubair's bitterness started to eclipse whatever hope remained. He felt betrayed by his own body. The dream he had once shared with Amara, to raise a child, to teach him or her about their shared Yoruba heritage, to watch their family line continue, now seemed impossible. Despite the setbacks, Amara remained patient and unwavering in her commitment to him. Though she longed for a child, she never once suggested leaving Zubair or seeking alternatives that might tear them apart. However, the quiet longing in her eyes spoke volumes. Every time friends brought their newborns for naming ceremonies, Amara would plaster on a supportive smile, only to return home and weep in private. Zubair, haunted by guilt, would sit beside her and stroke her hair, promising one day they would find an answer. That morning, Zubair had left the local clinic with a fresh wave of disappointment. The doctor's concerned expression made it clear that there was very little hope. The underlying issue was not only Zubair's sterility but also the fact that he had limited resources for advanced medical procedures like IVF or surrogacy. Even if a miracle was possible, it was far beyond their financial reach. It was then, on that sweltering walk back home, that a desperate, impossible notion took root in his mind. Zubair had once heard rumors about wealthy families, billionaires who, either out of vanity or lineage obsession, would do anything to ensure they had heirs. He had brushed off these stories as bizarre gossip. But what if there was some truth? What if, in exchange for granting them a child, someone might offer him the kind of money that could solve all of his and Amara's problems, generationally? It was an unsettling thought, morally troubling and deeply shameful. But as Zubair arrived back home to find the power cut again, NEPA strikes were merciless. With the fridge warm and empty, he felt the weight of desperation closing around him like a vice. A few days later, in an upscale district of Victoria Island, Zubair happened to attend a business seminar. He had always been an ambitious entrepreneur at heart, hoping one day to launch a tech startup that would cater to local markets in Lagos and beyond. He found himself in the orbit of men who radiated wealth, business moguls stepping out of bulletproof SUVs, accompanied by bodyguards, personal assistants, and members of their entourage. There, by sheer coincidence or some twist of fate, Zubair encountered Chief Afolabi Adelani, a billionaire rumored to have an uncanny Midas touch in everything from oil to the rapidly growing fintech sector. The chief was a tall, imposing figure who wore his success with casual confidence. Some said he had traveled across Africa and beyond, forging partnerships that only the elite could dream of. Stories swirled around Chief Adelani, whispers that, Despite his unimaginable wealth, his home remained empty of the laughter of children. Rumors suggested that he had been married twice, both marriages ending under murky circumstances, with no children to show for them. When Zubair caught sight of the chief up close, he noticed a certain tension etched into the older man's face, an expression that hinted at longing and sorrow just beneath the practiced smile of wealth. In what felt like an otherworldly stroke of luck, or perhaps a cosmic twist of destiny, Zubair found himself in the same elevator as the chief at the close of the seminar. The air was thick with mutual curiosity. Chief Adalani's sharp eyes took in every detail, from Zubair's worn-out shoes to the faint ring mark on his finger. The older man offered a polite nod of acknowledgement that invited conversation. Summoning courage, Zubair spoke about his own small-scale business ideas, fumbling over words in an attempt to pique the interest of a man whose time was reportedly worth millions of naira per minute. To Zubair's surprise, the chief listened with a measured politeness, occasionally nodding or asking questions. At the end of the ride, he handed Zubair a sleek black business card embossed with gold lettering. "Come see me at my office next week," he said in a voice that suggested both invitation and command. Zubair was too stunned to do much more than sputter a thank you. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the polished marble lobby, but for Zubair, it felt like he had stepped into another world. Later that night, sleepless on the thin mattress he shared with Amara, Zubair stared at the business card. A million thoughts raced through his mind, crashing into each other like storm waves against a rocky shore. He knew the rumor about the chief's desperation for a child. Zubair wondered, with a flicker of shame and a strange sense of morbid curiosity, what might happen if he hinted at a possibility, the possibility that maybe Amara could provide what the chief wanted. He tried to brush the thought away, but it lodged itself firmly in his psyche, refusing to be dislodged by moral caution or guilt. On one hand, the very idea was repulsive. He adored his wife, despite his insecurities about failing to give her a child. On the other hand, Zubair's desperation for financial security, and perhaps a flicker of hope that, in some twisted way, he could still see Amara become a mother, fed that dark notion until it formed the seeds of a plan. He told himself it was only speculation, a fleeting exploration of his darkest fears. He would never follow through. Or would he? The hours dragged on into the early morning. Rain started to fall, drumming against the rusted tin roof. Amara slept soundly beside him, her breath gentle and trusting. Zubair closed his eyes, but no peace came. All he could see was the silhouette of Chief Adalani, standing in a palatial mansion, handing him a set of crisp notes in a suitcase, while Amara stood off to the side, a painful question in her tear-streaked eyes. Why would you do this? In that silent, tormenting darkness, Zubair realized that his soul had reached a precipice. He told himself that he had not yet crossed any line. But in truth, by merely entertaining the thought, he sensed that a dangerous door had opened, a door that could change both their lives forever. 1 week later, Zubair found himself in the reception area of Adalani Towers, the crown jewel of Chief Afolabi Adalani's vast empire. It was a towering glass structure that seemed to pierce the sky, reflecting the bustling cityscape below. Stepping into the opulent lobby, Zubair marveled at the polished marble floors, the art installations from renowned West African sculptors, and the well-dressed professionals who bustled about, each seemingly more important than the next. He felt acutely out of place, wearing a borrowed suit that was one size too large, sleeves slightly frayed from years of neglect. The receptionist, a tall woman with meticulously braided hair, greeted him with a warm professionalism that made him feel slightly more at ease. She directed him to an elevator that rose silently to the top floor. When the doors slid open, Zubair emerged into a world of high finance and power. Thick carpets muted footsteps, and the walls were adorned with framed awards and photographs of Chief Adalani with world leaders and business magnates. The glass walls of the corridor offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Lagos Lagoon, stretching out toward the Atlantic. Zubair's heart thumped in his chest, pounding louder with every step he took. At the end of the corridor stood a set of imposing mahogany double doors. A discreet plaque read, "Afolabi Adalani, Sil." The waiting area just outside was decorated with tasteful furniture and potted palm plants that gave a gentle nod to the Nigerian tropics. Zubair barely had time to take a seat before a poised executive assistant beckoned him in, her tone polite yet efficient. Inside the office, Chief Afolabi Adelani sat behind an enormous desk made of rare hardwood, polished until it gleamed. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, revealing a corner office that was part command center, part personal haven. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with titles on African economics, global trade, and philanthropic endeavors. Behind the chief hung a large portrait of him shaking hands with the president of Nigeria, a symbolic testament to his influence. "Ah, my young friend from the seminar. Zubair, isn't it?" the chief said, rising to greet him. A faint smile played on his lips, though his posture radiated the confidence of a man used to being in control. He gestured for Zubair to sit, then followed suit. "Thank you for inviting me, sir," Zubair managed, suddenly self-conscious. His gaze darted around the luxurious office before settling on the chief, who seemed to watch him intently, as though reading his every thought. "Relax," the chief said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I was intrigued by your ideas at the seminar. Your pitch was raw, but I sense potential in you. A certain drive." He glanced down at a neat folder on his desk, the corners of his mouth twitching in thought. "Tell me more about your tech solutions. How you see them helping everyday Nigerians?" Zubair felt a wave of relief. For the next 20 minutes, he explained his concept, a mobile platform that would help local artisans and small businesses connect directly with customers, cutting out exploitative middlemen. He spoke passionately about bridging the gap between technology and the informal sector. Though he had yet to fully develop the idea, his vision was clear. Chief Adelani listened with measured interest, occasionally asking probing questions that displayed not only business acumen but an awareness of socio-economic realities. When he was satisfied, he tapped the folder gently. "You know, I have a foundation, the Adelani Future Fund, that invests in promising social enterprises. If we find synergy, we might offer seed funding or a mentorship opportunity." Hope soared in Zubair's chest. "That would be incredible, sir," he replied, trying to mask the excitement in his voice. "I've been trying to get funding for months now, but capital in Lagos can be hard to secure if you don't have the right connections." The chief nodded. "Connections are everything. But potential is also everything. I can open doors if the project and the person behind it is worth the risk." He paused, then leaned forward, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "Tell me about your personal life. You mentioned you were married?" Zubair blinked, caught off guard by the sudden pivot in conversation. "Yes, sir. My wife's name is Amara. We've been married for nearly 5 years, he replied, carefully measuring his words. He wondered if the chief had guessed his desperation, if that rumor about the chief's longing for an heir might surface now. The chief studied him for a moment, fingers steepled in front of him. "And children?" The question hung in the air, gentle yet pointed. Zubair felt as though his heart had been snagged by a barbed hook. He swallowed hard. "No, sir. Unfortunately, not yet." The shame that came with admitting his sterility threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to maintain composure. A flicker of something, pain, perhaps, passed across Chief Adelani's eyes. "I see," he said softly, as if tasting the weight of those words. The office fell into a contemplative silence. After a beat, the chief straightened up in his seat. "Well, life is unpredictable. Some of us are blessed in ways others are not, and vice versa. But that doesn't mean solutions do not exist. Sometimes, those solutions come from unexpected arrangements." Zubair's breath caught in his throat. Was the chief hinting at the unthinkable? He forced a polite smile, but inside, the turmoil raged. Could he really know what I'm thinking? Zubair wondered. Or was this merely an observation? Once their conversation about business resumed, Zubair tried to focus on the numbers and the logistics of a pilot launch. Yet his thoughts drifted to the deeper meaning behind the chief's words. The meeting ended with a polite handshake and a promise. Zubair would develop a more concrete proposal, and the chief would arrange a follow-up to discuss potential funding. Zubair left the office feeling both buoyed by hope and uneasy about the road ahead. That night, he relayed the day's events to Amara. She was excited about the possibility of securing the seed funding for his project, but she also sensed his restlessness. "Are you sure everything is okay?" she asked, worry etched into her features. Their one-bedroom apartment was cramped, the small kitchen separated from the living area by a flimsy curtain. Amara stood by the stove, stirring stew, while Zubair paced in the meager space near the worn-out couch. He hesitated before replying. "I'm just overwhelmed, that's all. The chief asked me about children. Felt personal." He left it at that, not wanting to burden her with the darkest corners of his thoughts. Amara nodded slowly, turning her attention back to the stew. "It's normal for people here to ask such questions, especially older men. It's a cultural thing, yes, but it can be invasive. Just be honest and polite as you've always been." Zubair watched her, feeling a mixture of love and guilt. She had given up so much to be with him, to stand by him when life seemed to slam every door in their faces. The mention of children, though casual enough in many contexts, was a knife twist in their reality. He moved behind her and placed a tender hand on her shoulder. "I love you," he said quietly. "Always remember that." Her eyes softened as she turned to smile at him. "I love you too. That's enough for me." Yet Zubair knew deep down that for her, it wasn't entirely enough. She also longed to be a mother. He sensed the emptiness in the corners of her heart, an emptiness mirrored by his own. Throughout the meal, he felt an unspoken tension hovering between them, as if both were aware of the sacrifices they might one day have to make. 2 days later, Zubair received a call from the chief's office. Another meeting was set, and this time, the invitation was extended not only to Zubair but to Amara as well. The request was framed politely. Chief Adalani wanted to meet the people behind the business ideas he might invest in, including their family. For a moment, fear seized Zubair's chest. Was this the moment the chief would unveil his own proposition? And how could Zubair bring this up to Amara without alarming her? He pondered these questions for a long while before telling Amara about the invitation. She was apprehensive at first. She had never stood before billionaires or high-profile executives. But with Zubair's reassurance and the purchase of a modest yet elegant gown from a local boutique, she agreed to attend. On the appointed day, she accompanied Zubair back to Adalani Towers, stepping into a realm of polished chrome and architectural marvel that seemed to belong to another world entirely. They were ushered into a spacious lounge adjacent to the chief's private office, decorated with tasteful African art and plush leather sofas. The wide windows offered a breathtaking view of the lagoon and eco-Atlantic city's developing skyline. As they waited, Zubair held Amara's hand, wondering if he might sense when they were taking that final step into the labyrinth of moral compromise. He couldn't decide if he hoped for or dreaded whatever would happen next. For many in Lagos, a morning at Adalani Towers would be a dream, an intersection of power and privilege that the average person could only glimpse from outside, gazing up at the glimmering spire piercing the West African sky. For Zubair and Amara, it felt like stepping onto a stage they had never rehearsed for. Yet there they were, sitting side by side in the Billionaire's private lounge. Chief Afolabi Adalani entered the room with an air of command. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, he walked over, his expensive cologne preceding him. He greeted both of them warmly, inviting them to sit at a small round table by the window. A waiter in a crisp white shirt quickly appeared, offering fresh fruit juice and bottles of premium water. Amara thanked him quietly, still getting used to the grandeur. "Welcome, Mrs. Kamau," the chief said, addressing her with impeccable courtesy. "Zubair has spoken highly of you. I must say, you both make a lovely couple." "Thank you, Chief," Amara replied with a respectful dip of her head. She tried to match his calm demeanor but couldn't shake the feeling that this was an audition of sorts. They spent the first portion of the meeting exchanging pleasantries. The chief asked Amara about her background, her family in Abeokuta, her studies in education, and her passion for teaching disadvantaged children. She explained how she had always wanted to open a community literacy center. The sincerity in her voice caught the chief's attention. Even though his gaze was polite, she felt the intensity behind those eyes, as though he was evaluating not just her words but the essence of who she was. Eventually, the conversation circled back to business. Zubair outlined his tech platform in more detail, mentioning possible pilot projects in local markets. The chief listened attentively, then steered the discussion toward broader issues of wealth, legacy, and posterity. Amara noted how he skillfully bridged the gap between commerce and personal ambition. "You see," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I believe in planting seeds for the future. Not just financial seeds but familial seeds. One must ensure one's legacy is passed on. Don't you agree?" Zubair swallowed. Amara, oblivious to the deeper implications, nodded. "Yes, Chief," she replied. "We must all contribute to something greater than ourselves, be it in society or within our families." A moment of charged silence settled over them. The chief studied them both, then pushed back from the table. He invited them to walk with him through a hallway decorated with large photographs, his philanthropic projects in rural parts of Nigeria, orphanages he funded, scholarships he provided for brilliant but underprivileged youths. Each image seemed to convey a message: "I have done so much good, but something is missing." They stopped at a particularly moving photograph. The chief standing beside a group of children in matching school uniforms, all grinning ear to ear. "These children are from the Kawa orphanage outside Abuja," he said softly. "Bright minds. I make donations there every month, but I can't help feeling it's never enough." Amara felt a tug at her heart. "They look so happy. It's wonderful that you provide for them," she said, meeting his gaze with genuine admiration. Zubair remained silent, pondering the power dynamics at play. The chief nodded. "Yes, indeed. But it's one thing to care for children who are not yours. It's another to have your own flesh and blood, to pass on your name, your heritage, to a child of your lineage." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he continued walking, guiding them through an open door that led into a more intimate sitting area. A single question reverberated in Zubair's mind. Is this the moment he'll propose the unthinkable? Anxiety coiled in his stomach. After they settled on a soft leather sofa, the chief sighed, as if burdened by an invisible weight. "Zubair, my friend," he said solemnly, "I think it's time we speak plainly." Zubair's mouth went dry. He exchanged a glance with Amara, who now looked puzzled. She could sense the shift in the room, the tension that crackled like static in the air. "Go on, sir," Zubair managed, unsure if he truly wanted to hear the words that would follow. "Everyone knows I have done well in business," the chief began. "I have built an empire, but as I get older, I'm confronted by one undeniable fact. There is no heir to carry on my name. My marriages have failed, for reasons I won't bore you with. But in each, the hope of a child was never realized." His voice trembled slightly. "You might call it arrogance, or perhaps old-fashioned culture, but it is my dream, my obsession, if you will, to have a child of my own." Amara shifted uncomfortably, her hand instinctively seeking Zubair's for reassurance. Zubair's heart hammered, feeling like each beat collided with a sense of dread and curiosity. Where is he going with this? He wondered, though a corner of his mind already suspected. "I've heard stories, Chief," Zubair said carefully. "Stories about men who find unconventional ways to continue their bloodline. But that's typically rumor and talk around the city." The chief nodded gravely. "Indeed. Rumors abound, and I won't deny that I've entertained certain possibilities. Surrogacy, IVF, adoption. But nothing so far has worked, or it's been entangled in complexities." He turned his gaze to Amara, his tone softening. "I see a light in your eyes, Mrs. Kamau, the kind of warmth that would nurture a child. With your husband's permission, I'd like to propose a unique arrangement." Amara's eyes went wide. She glanced at Zubair, confusion etched into her face. Slowly, the realization of what the chief implied seeped into her consciousness, and her grip on Zubair's hand tightened. "You want my wife to bear your child?" Zubair asked bluntly, each word leaving his mouth like a piece of broken glass. He already sensed the answer, but he needed it spoken aloud to be sure. The chief exhaled, sadness mingling with resolve. "I do. But not just that. I want her as my wife. Properly. I am prepared to offer you a fortune. Enough to fund your business ventures, support your family, and never worry about money again. More than that, you'd be set for life. I want an heir, Zubair, and I see no other way. Amara let out a small gasp, her cheeks flaming. She felt an indescribable shock course through her body. Never in her life had she imagined such a proposition, one that treated her like an asset to be traded. She looked at Zubair, hoping he would immediately refuse to stand and walk away with her. Yet she saw the conflict in his eyes, pain, guilt, and even temptation. Zubair struggled for words. He had anticipated something along these lines, but hearing it concretely voiced tore him apart. Amara is not an item for sale, he said in a trembling voice, though he didn't stand up or storm out. A part of him loathed himself in that moment. Of course not, the chief said in a tone that tried to be conciliatory. This is not a transaction of property, but a contract of mutual consent. She would be cared for, respected, and if she chooses, she could have all the privileges that come with being my wife. You too would benefit greatly. But I will not force anything, obviously. The final decision is yours and hers. Amara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. How did life bring us to this? She thought, shooting a pleading look at her husband. But Zubair, in his desperate, confused state, remained silent. The chief, perhaps sensing the shock of the moment, quietly rose from his seat. I think it's best you two talk this over in private, he said gently. I do hope you'll consider my proposal, but rest assured, there is no pressure. The choice is yours, though you should know that this offer might not remain open indefinitely. With that, he stepped out, leaving the couple alone in the lavish room overlooking the city that now seemed to trap them in an ethical and emotional snare. For several minutes, neither Zubair nor Amara spoke. Her tears broke the silence first. She turned away from him, trying to hide the despair that overwhelmed her. Zubair placed a hand on her shoulder, an apology trembling on his lips. Amma. He began, but she cut him off. Don't, she whispered, voice quivering. Don't say anything yet. I just need a moment. She wiped her eyes, then turned to face him, searching for any sign of sanity in this madness. You can't be seriously considering this. Tell me you're not. I don't know, he stammered, feeling the sting of those words even as they left his mouth. Amara, you know how long we've wanted a child. This might be our only chance for you to. For me to what? She exclaimed, her voice low and pained. Sleep with another man to have his child? To become the wife of a stranger? You're my husband, Zubair. His eyes welled up with tears of his own. I know. But you also deserve a chance to be a mother. We both deserve a chance to have a better life. I love you, but I'm sterile. He forced the admission out, letting the heartbreak saturate his words. I failed you. I can't give you the family you want. Amara's anguish hardened into a quiet fury. I stood by you through this struggle because I love you, not because I wanted to trade our marriage for some twisted arrangement. We can still adopt. We can find another path. Her voice trembled with both sorrow and indignation. Zubair clasped her hands in his, tears now streaming freely. He felt like a drowning man, gasping for air, unsure which way was up. I'm lost, Amara, he admitted, voice cracking. I want you to be happy. I want you to have every good thing in life. And yes, I can't lie, I'm tempted by the money, by the chance to escape this cycle of poverty and frustration. But I won't force you. I could never do that. Amara closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She knew their marriage was at a precarious crossroads. Yet despite her anger, she could see Zubair's despair and vulnerability. Neither spoke as they collected themselves. The city sprawled beneath them, indifferent to the couple's anguish. Eventually, they left Adalani Towers, each step weighed down by the knowledge that the next conversation they had would determine the future of their marriage, and perhaps their very souls. Zubair and Amara spoke little during the ride back to their one-bedroom flat. The usual cacophony of Lagos, blaring horns, street hawkers shouting about gala sausage rolls and bottled water, Danfo buses belching smoke, seemed to pass by in a haze. Amara stared out the window, her mind reeling. Zubair glanced over occasionally, wishing he could find words that didn't taste like betrayal. When they finally reached their modest apartment, the silence felt even more suffocating. Amara walked straight to the bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the shower. Zubair listened to the water run, imagining her tears mixing with the rush from the showerhead. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. Guilt gnawed at him. He had opened this door, even if unintentionally, by sharing their plight with the chief and not shutting down his proposition immediately. After a while, Amara emerged, dressed in a loose t-shirt and leggings, her hair damp and pulled back from her face. She looked calmer, but her eyes were rimmed with the rawness of tears. Zubair stood as she approached, bracing himself for confrontation. Instead, she sat beside him, resting her head wearily on his shoulder. "We can't do this," she said, her voice hushed yet resolute. "No amount of money, no desire for a child, can justify tearing our marriage apart. You agree, don't you?" Zubair nodded, exhaling a tremulous sigh. "I do. It's just, I suppose part of me kept wondering if there was a way to make everyone happy, but that's a fantasy." "You're right." Amara sniffed, then offered him a fragile smile. "I married you for better or worse, remember? We face life's challenges together. This arrangement with the chief, it's the opposite of everything we stand for." A sense of relief and love washed over Zubair, and he wrapped his arms around her. "Thank you, Amara," he whispered, pressing his lips to her forehead. They remained that way for a while, finding solace in each other's closeness. However, over the next few days, an invisible wedge formed between them. Neither spoke of it directly, but the tension was there. Zubair threw himself into refining his business proposal, hoping to secure funding through legitimate channels. But every door he knocked on seemed to slam shut, often citing lack of experience or insufficient market validation. Amara searched for a more stable teaching job, but private schools in Lagos were notoriously competitive, and her phone remained silent. The frustration of their precarious circumstances intensified. The memory of the chief's offer lingered like a ghost in their apartment. Whenever Zubair saw Amara staring wistfully at a friend's baby on social media or lighting up at the sight of children playing on the street, he felt a pang of guilt and anger at his own shortcomings. Was he depriving her of motherhood? Would she eventually resent him for turning down the only real chance they might have for a biological child? Late one evening, while the power was out and they relied on candlelight to cook dinner, Zubair finally voiced the questions that had been gnawing at him. "Amara," he began carefully, "do you ever wonder, what if we had said yes? Just so you could have a baby? Don't you think about it?" She shot him a sharp look, nearly dropping the spoon she was using to stir a pot of stew. "Zubair, no. I've made up my mind. That's not the life I want, child or no child. Why are you bringing this up again?" He swallowed, feeling the heat in her gaze. "I'm sorry. I saw how happy you were last week when we visited your cousin's newborn. I can't get it out of my head. I feel like I'm failing you." Amara turned off the stove, then faced him directly, candlelight dancing across the tension in her features. "You're not failing me. You're my husband. We can look into adoption. Or see if there are other medical solutions. But I won't become a billionaire's trophy wife for the sake of an heir." Her eyes softened. "You have to believe me when I say I'd rather never have children than lose what we share." Zubair nodded, tears pricking his eyes. He pulled her into an embrace. "I'm sorry. I just needed to hear you say it again," he murmured into her hair. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A week later, the local landlord knocked on their door. He was a rotund man with a perpetually sweaty face, demanding the overdue rent. They were 2 months behind, and he had grown tired of their promises. "By the end of next week," he warned, "or find yourself another place. I have plenty of tenants looking for a flat." He left them with a stark ultimatum. That same day, Zubair lost a freelance gig that had been their financial lifeline. As if insult were added to injury, the manager who had contracted him admitted they needed to cut costs and found a cheaper alternative. By dusk, Zubair was frantic, calling old contacts and begging for loans, only to be met with polite rejections or unanswered messages. 2 days later, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up outside their apartment. From the passenger seat emerged a sharply dressed man who asked their neighbor for directions. Amara watched warily from the window. Something about the man's demeanor and the polished, expensive look of the SUV made her uneasy. She prayed it wasn't trouble. Moments later, the man stood at their door. Zubair opened it cautiously. "Can I help you?" The stranger offered a curt bow. "Mr. Kamau? I am Mr. Daimeji, special assistant to Chief Afalabi Adalani. May I come in?" Unease coiled in Zubair's stomach, but he stepped aside to let the visitor enter the cramped living area. Amara hovered in the background, arms folded protectively. The man glanced around, taking in the modest surroundings with an impassive expression. Then he turned to face them both, his voice measured. "The chief hopes this message finds you both well," he began. "He regrets the discomfort his earlier proposal may have caused. However, he also wants to reaffirm his interest in an arrangement with Mrs. Kamau. He's prepared to increase the financial offer significantly. Specifically, he will buy you a house in Ikoyi, set up a trust fund, and fund your technology venture, Mr. Kamau. Additionally, he will sponsor any professional dreams Mrs. Kamau may have. Naturally, the condition remains that Mrs. Kamau becomes his wife and bears his child." Amara's jaw tightened. She wanted to scream or throw something, but the presence of this formal messenger, ironically, made her freeze. Instead, she fixed him with a glare. "Tell the chief I am not for sale," she said, her voice low and trembling. "We've made ourselves clear." Mr. Daimeji nodded. "I understand, madam. However, the chief instructed me to leave this envelope with you, in hopes you'll reconsider." He extended a bulky brown envelope toward Zubair, who stared at it like it was a venomous snake. "There's no pressure," the assistant continued, "but my number is inside. If you need anything, call. The chief cares for you both and wants you to have time to think." Zubair's hands shook as he reached for the envelope. He knew it contained money, and possibly a contract detailing the arrangement. The messenger offered a polite bow and left. The hum of the SUV's engine soon faded into the din of traffic. For a long time, Zubair and Amara simply stared at the envelope. Eventually, Zubair tore it open. Inside was a thick sheaf of crisp dollar bills, more money than they had ever seen at once. There was also a typed letter from the chief. In it, he apologized for any offense, re-emphasized his desperation for an heir, and reminded them of the potential life-changing rewards. Attached was a business card with a single phone number. A swirling tide of emotions engulfed the couple. The sight of that money was a bitter reminder of how dire their situation had become. The landlord's ultimatum, their mounting debts, their shattered dreams, all had turned them into easy prey for a man like the chief. Despite their moral revulsion, a fissure cracked open in the bedrock of their resolve. Amara sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Why won't he leave us alone?" she moaned, her voice muffled. Zubair knelt beside her, the wad of cash still in his shaking hand. He placed it on the table as though it weighed 1,000 kilos. "I don't know," he admitted, tears brimming. "But I do know we need this money. God help us, we really do." Their eyes met, each reflecting the fear, love, and desperation that threatened to pull them under. In that silent exchange, they realized that turning away from the chief's proposition was no longer a simple moral stance. It was a choice that could mean homelessness, hunger, and continued infertility frustrations. Whether they liked it or not, their circumstances had changed the equation. The real question was, how far would they go before they lost themselves entirely? The next several days passed in a blur of internal battles for Zubair and Amara. The envelope of money remained on their old wooden coffee table, untouched except for occasional moments when one of them would restlessly count the bills or read the chief's letter again, as though searching for a hidden catch or some sign of trickery. Yet the money was real, enough to pay off the landlord, settle their debts, and sustain them for months. It was a lifeline in a city that offered them no mercy. Still, the moral price was steep. Each morning, Amara woke up from fitful sleep, her thoughts consumed by the question, "Am I really capable of this?" She imagined what life would be like as the chief's wife, living in a mansion in Ikoyi, wearing expensive lace at upscale Owambi parties. She envisioned servants, drivers, socialites, and the relentless gaze of the public eye. But in her mind, no matter how opulent the fantasy, It was always overshadowed by the horrifying reality that she would no longer be with Zubair. Meanwhile, Zubair was tormented by guilt and shame. He found himself quietly researching surrogacy laws, adoption procedures, even polygamy among certain Nigerian communities, as though hoping to find a loophole that would make the chief's arrangement more palatable. But each option seemed either too expensive, too complex, or simply not feasible in the time they had. And time was running out. Their landlord's deadline loomed, and job prospects weren't improving. Under the relentless strain, arguments flared between them. "Why do you keep looking at that letter?" Amara snapped one afternoon, catching Zubair in the act of rereading the chief's proposition. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom, arms folded, a storm gathering behind her eyes. He set the letter aside, rubbing his temples. "Because I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to negotiate. I don't want to lose you, Amara, but I also don't want us living on the streets." She let out a frustrated sigh. "You think I don't know that? You think I'm not terrified of what happens if we can't pay rent next week?" Her voice softened. "But does it have to be me getting pregnant by another man? Another man who wants to marry me and take me away from you?" Zubair couldn't answer. He merely shook his head, tears threatening to spill. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I wish I could give you a child. I wish I could give you a stable home." Amara's stance softened. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I married you for you, Zubair. Children, money, they're important, but they're not everything." She paused, her eyes flickering to the envelope on the table. "But we have to face reality. We are in trouble. Big trouble." That same evening, a neighbor casually mentioned seeing men in suits surveying the property. Word spread that the landlord was searching for new tenants, ones who could pay a higher rent. Panic set in. In a city where rents skyrocketed daily, finding a new place, let alone affording it, felt like an insurmountable climb. Late that night, Zubair paced their dark living room, phone in hand. The single overhead bulb flickered, threatening to plunge them into darkness. Outside, the hum of a generator droned from a neighbor's flat. Amara sat on the couch, her head leaning against the wall, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Amara," Zubair began, his voice barely audible over the generator's buzz. "I think I should call him." She lifted her head, eyes widening in alarm. "Who? The chief?" "No, his assistant. Daimeji. Just to—" He swallowed, unable to look her in the eye. "We have the money he left, but if we decide we're not going through with the arrangement, we should return it, right? We can't just keep it. That would be—" "I don't know, it feels wrong." Amara nodded, relief flooding her features. Yes, let's return it. We'll find another way." Even as she said the words, they both knew another way was perilously unclear. Still, some moral lines had to be drawn. Zubair dialed the number, his heart pounding. The call connected almost immediately. Mr. Daimeji's voice, crisp and courteous, filled the other end. "Mr. Kamau, how may I assist you tonight?" "My wife and I appreciate the chief's generosity, but we cannot accept his proposal," Zubair began, words stumbling out. "We would like to return the money." A pause on the other side. "I see. Well, that is certainly your choice. May I ask what your reason is?" Zubair felt a flash of anger. As if it's not obvious, he thought. But he answered calmly, "Our marriage is not something we're prepared to barter. It goes against our values." Another silence, followed by a sigh. "I understand. Where would you like me to pick up the envelope?" Zubair provided their address. The call ended with a simple, "I'll be there shortly." He and Amara looked at each other, a mixture of fear and resolve. Returning the money meant returning to their precarious reality, overdue rent, no prospects, no child. Yet at least they could salvage their dignity, or so they hoped. About an hour later, headlights cut through the darkness outside their building. Zubair recognized the same black SUV. He descended the narrow stairs to the front entrance, where Mr. Daimeji awaited with 2 bodyguards. After a brief greeting, Zubair handed over the envelope, carefully avoiding eye contact. "I respect your decision," the assistant said in a hushed tone. "But the chief wanted me to remind you that the offer remains open if you change your mind. Consider it carefully." He dipped his head, then climbed back into the SUV. The vehicle roared away, leaving a swirl of dust in its wake. Zubair ascended the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he entered the flat, Amara rushed to him, searching his face for a sign of relief or regret. "It's done," he murmured. She exhaled, tears forming. They sank onto the couch together, holding each other, uncertain and vulnerable, but momentarily relieved to have regained some sense of moral clarity. However, that relief was short-lived. The next morning, they awoke to loud knocking. The landlord stood at their door with a scowl. He demanded the rent plus a penalty fee, or else he would evict them in 24 hours. "I'm done waiting," he snarled. "But we have nowhere to go," Amara pleaded, tears in her eyes. The landlord shrugged. "Not my problem." With that, he stomped down the corridor, leaving them trembling in shock. Desperation set in. They called relatives, but none could house them long-term. Friends either had obligations or no spare room. That afternoon, a job interview Zubair had pinned his hopes on fell through. By evening, their phone data was almost finished, the electricity cut off, and they had only a few thousand naira left. Unable to sleep, Zubair wandered the neighborhood, trying to think of last-ditch solutions. He passed by children playing under a street lamp, their laughter ringing through the night air. A group of mothers chatted nearby, exchanging stories of baby milestones and daily struggles. Zubair felt a pang in his chest. Would he ever experience fatherhood? And a deeper pang for the precarious situation Amara and he faced. At midnight, he returned to find Amara lying awake on the mattress, eyes puffy from crying. "Zubair," she said in a trembling voice, "what if the best thing for us, for me, is to do as the chief wants?" He froze, a surge of conflicting emotions flooding him. "What are you saying?" She swallowed hard. "We can't survive like this. Tomorrow, we'll have no roof over our heads. And I can't bear the thought of you blaming yourself forever for my childlessness. This might be our only chance for me to have a biological child. Or for you to break free from this cycle. We can't keep pretending there's a magical solution." A tear slipped down Zubair's cheek. "Amar, I can't let you." His voice trailed off, drowning in his own turmoil. He wanted to scream no, but the logic of their desperation loomed. The truth was, they were out of options. She reached for his hand, her gaze resolute despite the tears. "If it's what it takes to save us from destitution, perhaps I should. But only if you truly agree." In that heart-wrenching moment, they both understood the enormity of the decision. There would be no going back. Their marriage, their love, the sanctity of their union, everything would be tested and possibly destroyed. Yet so too would their lives be destroyed if they remained in abject poverty, torn apart by circumstances out of their control. Zubair finally found words, though they emerged as a broken whisper. "I don't want to lose you, Amara." She squeezed his hand, tears streaming freely. "But if we do this, maybe I can still love you, in my heart, even if I must become his wife in name." The hypocrisy of the notion was almost laughable. Could she really love two men? Could she share a life with one and a history with another? They had no answers, only despairing hope. They held each other through the night, weeping, unable to sleep or even properly think. As dawn broke over Lagos, and the call to prayer echoed from nearby mosques, they made an unspoken pact. Their hearts felt shattered, but they told themselves it was the only way to salvage something from the wreckage of their lives. That morning, with trembling fingers, Zubair dialed Mr. Daimeji's number. When the assistant answered, Zubair's voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell the chief, we agree to his terms. But we have conditions of our own." A pause on the other line, then an exhalation of satisfaction. "Very well, Mr. Kamau. I'll inform the chief immediately. He'll be pleased." Zubair ended the call, tears of anguish flooding his eyes. "Please." That word felt like a cruel joke. Because in that moment, with a heart riddled by guilt and dread, Zubair knew that no one, least of all himself, would truly find peace or pleasure in what was to come. A whirlwind of events followed. Within hours, another black SUV arrived to ferry Zubair and Amara to a luxurious hotel near Victoria Island. They were given a suite on one of the top floors, with a panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean. The chief, citing discreetness and propriety, had insisted they stay there while the final negotiations were made. He said it was for their comfort, but it felt more like a holding cell paved with gold. For 3 days, they remained in that plush isolation. Lawyers and aides visited sporadically, presenting documents that outlined the terms of the marriage arrangement. A portion read like a prenuptial contract, specifying that Amara would officially be recognized as the chief's wife, with all the rights and privileges thereof. Zubair would receive a lump sum to launch his business, along with additional funds to ensure he never faced poverty again. Amara herself would be guaranteed a monthly stipend, separate from the chief's estate, to use as she wished. One line, however, stung more than the rest. Any child born of this union shall bear the Adilani name and be recognized as the legitimate heir of Chief Afolabi Adilani. Reading those words caused Amara to break down, shutting herself in the bathroom of the suite. Zubair, hearing her muffled sobs, felt his own resolve crumble anew. He yearned to tear the contract to shreds and storm out, but each time he recalled the landlord's ultimatum, their empty bank account, and the promise of eviction looming like a guillotine. "We have no choice," he would remind himself, though the reassurance felt hollow. On the evening of the 3rd day, Chief Adilani himself arrived. He wore a crisp white agbada embroidered with gold thread, projecting an aura of both wealth and authority. His eyes, however, betrayed nervousness, a man who had cornered the market on many things but was stepping into new, uncertain territory. He asked to speak privately with Zubair, who agreed reluctantly. They sat in the small lounge area of the suite, the lights of Lagos twinkling through the window behind them. The chief cleared his throat. "I understand this is not easy for you," he began, his tone subdued. "I want you to know I respect you both. I have no intention of humiliating you." Zubair stared at the carpet. "It still feels like humiliation," he said, the words sounding dull and lifeless. "I love my wife. I want her to be happy." The chief nodded gravely. "I will not deny that this is unusual, and that I'm motivated by my own selfish desire for an heir. But I will do everything in my power to ensure she is cared for and respected. That is my oath." Zubair's jaw clenched. "I suppose that's all I can hope for." They spoke for a few more minutes, with the chief clarifying some details. The ceremony would be small and private to avoid media scrutiny, a few witnesses only. Afterward, Amara would move into a house he had prepared in Ikoyi, while Zubair would be granted his own property in nearby Lekki, far enough for appearances' sake but close enough to maintain contact if they wished. Later that night, in the privacy of their bedroom, Amara clung to Zubair, trembling. "I'm so scared," she whispered. "What if this changes me? I forget how to love you." Zubair pressed his forehead against hers, tears sliding down his cheeks. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I keep asking myself if this is some test or a punishment for our desperation." They held each other as though the dawn would bring an apocalypse, and, in a sense, it would mark the end of their marriage as they knew it. The day of the ceremony came swiftly. True to the chief's word, it was a small affair, held in a private garden behind his mansion. A high-ranking official from the marriage registry arrived to perform the legalities. Amara wore a simple cream-colored gown, her face veiled not in celebration but in sorrow. The chief stood tall beside her, adorned in regal Yoruba attire. Zubair watched from a short distance, his heart splitting with each vow. No crowd cheered, no music played. The final recitation of the vows fell like a hammer on both Zubair and Amara's souls. Once the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the chief carefully lifted the veil and gave Amara a tender, almost apologetic kiss on the cheek. She forced a tight smile, tears glistening in her eyes. In that moment, Zubair turned away, unable to witness more. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in a grand hall. Luxurious tables were set with exotic flowers and expensive champagne. The few attendees included the chief's closest associates, but no one from Amara or Zubair's family. Secrecy was paramount. Amara sat stiffly, answering polite questions from well-wishers who seemed more intrigued than genuinely happy. Zubair tried to mingle, but every conversation felt suffocating. The question he heard repeatedly, "How do you know the chief?" nearly broke him each time. He mumbled something about a business partnership, avoiding eye contact. At last, he escaped to the mansion's balcony, desperate for air. He stared at the sprawling gardens below, the moonlight casting silver beams on manicured lawns that seemed to mock him with their perfection. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Amara, still in her wedding gown, hugging her arms as if to protect herself from an invisible chill. Their eyes locked, and a torrent of emotions passed between them: regret, love, longing, guilt. "This feels like a dream," she murmured. "A terrible, twisted dream." Zubair reached out, and she took his hand, her fingers trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice thick with despair. "I never meant for this to happen." Zubair reached out, and she took his hand, her fingers trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice thick with despair. "I never meant for this to happen." They stood like that for a moment, two souls bound by love yet divided by circumstance, until a distant voice called Amara's name. She gave Zubair a final, sorrowful glance before returning to the reception. Zubair remained on the balcony, struggling to breathe. The next morning, the chief's lawyers finalized the transfer of funds and property deeds to Zubair's name. He stared at the documents, feeling an empty hollowness. The numbers looked astronomical, but they might as well have been worthless scraps of paper. What did he truly gain in exchange for giving up his wife? Days blended into weeks. Amara moved into the chief's Ikoyi residence, her new home. Zubair relocated to the modest townhouse in Lekki, ironically more comfortable than anywhere he had lived before. He used some of the money to start his tech company, forging partnerships in the local market. Financially, life improved drastically. With the backing of the chief's name, albeit discreetly, doors that had once been locked now swung open. Investors lined up to hear his pitch. Gradually, the veneer of success began to coat the deep cracks in Zubair's soul, yet the cracks remained, gaping and unhealed. Meanwhile, Amara found herself living in gilded loneliness. The chief was kind, respectful, even doting at times. He provided her with personal chefs, drivers, maids, every comfort imaginable. She had a luxurious private suite, complete with a walk-in closet overflowing with designer clothes. Yet at night, she often cried herself to sleep, missing Zubair's familiar warmth and the simple, genuine love they had shared. Inevitably, she and the chief became intimate. He was gentle, understanding of her hesitations. Still, each time they shared a bed, she felt a piece of her heart recoil. She reminded herself of the bigger picture. "I'm doing this for our future, for a chance to have a child." Each morning, she checked her body for signs, wondering if, at last, she was pregnant. Meanwhile, the chief would watch her with hopeful eyes, as though she were a vessel carrying his greatest treasure. Yet as weeks turned into months, no pregnancy occurred. Doctors, summoned discreetly, ran tests and found no obvious impediment. The chief grew anxious, though he tried not to show it. Amara felt a terrible sense of déjà vu, another man whose legacy hinged on her womb. Deep down, she was terrified that perhaps she was the infertile one all along, that Zubair's sterility wasn't the sole issue. The guilt gnawed at her. If she couldn't provide a child for the chief, what was this sacrifice for? On the other side of Lagos, Zubair threw himself into work, days and nights melting into endless coding sessions, investor meetings, and expansions. Though his business thrived, he felt no elation. Each success reminded him of the real cost: Amara's presence in another man's home. He found himself awake at night, replaying memories of their courtship at university, her laughter, the way she'd hold his hand during campus walks. Now, everything felt like an echo. He tried to stay away, convinced that contact would only reopen wounds. But one humid afternoon, unable to bear the silence any longer, he called her. She answered in a hesitant voice, as though unsure if she had the right to speak freely. It took only a few minutes for both to break down in sobs. She told him she missed him, that the mansion felt suffocating. He told her he was proud of her strength but also racked with guilt. They made vague promises to meet, but time passed, overshadowed by caution and heartbreak. Then, one fateful evening, Zubair's phone rang. Amara's voice came through, breathless and shaky. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Zubair felt his world tilt. A maelstrom of emotions, shock, joy, pain, envy, flooded him. He sank into a chair, tears bursting forth as he realized the final seal on this arrangement had been made. The child that should have been his was now fathered by another man. The heartbreak was immediate and savage. Yet beneath the sorrow, he felt relief that Amara would at least fulfill her dream of motherhood. He forced himself to say congratulations, though the word tasted bitter on his tongue. The next 9 months were a blur for all involved. The chief lavished even more care on Amara, ensuring she had the best prenatal facilities. Zubair drifted like a phantom, unstoppable in his business pursuits yet deadened inside. Finally, the day came. Amara gave birth to a healthy baby boy at a private hospital. The chief, overjoyed, publicly announced his heir in a carefully managed press release. But in the privacy of the hospital room, amid the sterile smell of disinfectant and the newborn's cries, Amara held her son close, tears cascading as she whispered Zubair's name. Later that night, while the chief celebrated in the hospital's VIP lounge, Zubair managed to slip into the room. He found Amara alone, cradling the baby in her arms. The moment their eyes met, words failed. Zubair approached cautiously, overcome by the pure innocence in that tiny face. "He's beautiful," Zubair thought, heartbreak choking his voice. He gently touched the baby's small hand, feeling soft fingers wrap around his. In that instant, all the walls between them broke. Amara reached out and grasped Zubair's arm. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. I wish this was our child." Zubair felt tears spill down his cheeks. "But in a way, he's still a part of you. And you're part of me." He bowed his head, pressing it gently against hers. "I regret everything," he whispered, voice shattered by remorse. The baby stirred, letting out a faint whimper. Zubair realized then that no amount of wealth, no arrangement, could replace the unbreakable bond he shared with Amara, or the missing piece of his soul that would forever haunt him. He held both mother and child in his arms for a fleeting moment, a broken family reunited in heartbreak. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor, Chief Adalani's voice drawing near. Zubair pulled away, pressing a silent kiss to Amara's forehead. Without a word, he slipped out, leaving her with their final goodbyes still echoing in his heart. He roamed the hospital halls, consumed by a sense of irreversible loss. As he descended the stairs to the private car park, a single thought pounded in his mind. I sold my wife, and now I've lost her and the life we could have had. Instantly, regret flared like a scorching blaze, and he understood that no fortune could ever extinguish the pain of that choice. The end. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.